Considering that Garfield is the next franchise that Chris Pratt has been summoned into, bound by spirit through dark chanted incantations to possess another brand's soulless automaton with his signature and unique delivery that only a slim 2.5 billion individuals could replicate, assuming they were bored in the recording chamber, I decided it was my turn to the fat cat, to squeeze a little of that goopy cheese out of the lasagna. The goopy cheese, as it were, is the YouTube algorithm. Jesus Christ, I really need to get the kind of editor who is willing to say no when I just start rattling off whatever the fuck. Despite my cynical exterior, I actually don't harbor ill will towards the orange juggernaut. I do think the character is a mixed bag of asinine punchlines and the strangest balance of inconsistent, wholesome negativity you can find in fiction, but that's not an uncommon take. That's a rather normie opinion on Garfield, and I genuinely do not blame Jim Davis for a thing. If I could coast through the rest of my life comfortably on the overwhelming success of a mascot I could merely churn out milquetoast observations for, pretending I've made a joke, I would absolutely do that. He's worth hundreds of millions of dollars for copy-pasting I Hate Mondays. And sure, you could probably argue the franchise is a bit warped in the public consciousness nowadays, but I think that's a healthy degree of ironic fascination that brings more worth than it takes away from the character. Personally, I frequently create two-panel Garfield edits for the relevant online community because there is humor to be mined from what's already there. Though if you're more of the cast of Garfield are eldritch horrors tormenting John for his sins kind of gal, I'll respect you for that too. The point is, I knew I could have some guaranteed fun with Garf. If whatever I picked turned out bad, I could get the ironic enjoyment that comes from bad media. And if whatever I picked turned out good, I would also appreciate that and could say, see, told you there's occasional gold in them there hills. So next, I just sort of picked an old Garfield game, at random. I briefly considered Garfield, Caught in the Act for the Sega Genesis, but decided against that for a couple of reasons. Mainly because my brain fills in the title's implication with the humorous notion of John walking in to discover that Garfield doesn't make love. Garfield fucks. And I knew the game couldn't possibly live up to that expectation, no matter the quality. Instead, I went with Garfield's Nightmare for the Nintendo DS. This one brought a few more achievable expectations with it. First off, I immediately remembered Garfield's Scary Scavenger Hunt, a web browser game from when I was a kid, for the first time in years, and I had quite the fondness for that one. It had a genuine jump scare, and Lyman was locked up captive in a dungeon there, years after he'd stopped appearing in the comics. If you think that's tonally out of place for the franchise, my other reason is even weirder. All the way back in 1989, Garfield had a 6-comic strip story arc where he realized he was abandoned and alone for presumable years, and rapidly succumbed to delusions to escape the devastating existential dread, with the comic not only creating a likely deliberate undercurrent that he may be a lingering spirit haunting the place after his death, but also failing to establish it well enough that he's just having a nightmare, while instead establishing the more positive experience with John and Odie is a fake reality. Meaning it's now far more plausible to claim the entirety of Garfield canon is just hallucinated so he doesn't have to accept his own long-gone mortality. I may hate these kind of tropes in serious fan theories, but using them to absolutely shatter mediocre corporate churned family-friendly entertainment with far more justified textual evidence is hilarious. The point is, Garfield seems to have a good track record with nightmares and nightmare fuel, even from official sources, so my pick was easy. Garfield's Nightmare was released in 2007, developed by Sheenan Multimedia, whom I have no other context for, and looking at their library of works, I don't foresee myself coming back to them on here, which gave me a nice blank slate to start with. Firing it up, I was pleasantly surprised to realize I really like the title screen. 2D Garfunkel and logo in the middle of a 3D room is surprisingly artful. It would have been really cool to see the whole game in this style, with Gardasil as a 2D element amongst a 3D world, though they sadly did not go this route. It is a 2D platformer made in admittedly very pleasant 3D graphics, though it actually does play around with dimensions just a little bit in legitimately fun ways, which I'll explain later. I do think Garmadon still looks nice translated into 3D as he is here. It's not always easy to just literally bump up cartoon or comic characters into an extra dimension without massive changes. SpongeBob games typically don't quite look right for my expectations, and the less said about Fairly OddParents characters in Jimmy Neutron's style, the better. But the rotund tabby makes it work. To highlight the strengths of the rest, he ends up being one of the visuals I was least enamored with too, but I'll save other specifics for discussing the levels themselves. Because real gamers know not to put too much faith in positive graphical first impressions until the gameplay has a chance to speak for itself. And honestly, Gargamel's Nightmare shows a surprising amount of competency in its gameplay. And I don't mean the backhanded compliment of, well, it's competent. I mean Sheenan actually did a good job showing their hand at understanding fundamentals that separate fine enough 2D platformers from pretty good 2D platformers. I'm not trying to overplay my hand here. I don't want it to sound like this is some sort of innovative trailblazer in the genre. I wouldn't even go so far as to say this game necessarily has any original ideas in the first place. But for a licensed brand video game, especially a mascot platformer, a polished quality redundant of other polished quality in the medium is absolutely a less common find. I appreciate that. I was prepared to find a comic strip of the character being lazy to level at the devs, and I don't have to do that here. Gameplay is all very intuitive if you've played one of these before. Movement is left and right on the directional pad, with down for crawling, and up for entering doors on rare occasions. Interestingly, jumping is on A instead of the more common placement of B, with B being held midair for a butt slam. Y is used to drag crates, though that mechanic perplexingly vanishes halfway into the game. X gets nothing. Otherwise, the shoulder buttons let you pan the camera down and up for better visibility when you need it. None of this should sound too outrageous for the genre, and any additional controls probably would have muddied the waters. The touchscreen is only used to display certain items. Garth's face represents his lives, pizza pickups serve as the hit points, capping at 3, though he mistakenly says they cap at 5 early in the game. They also should have hired an editor. Donuts act much like coins in Super Mario, where gathering 100 gives you an extra, additional life, and proper coins themselves are used to enter secret minigame doors hidden in the levels. Controls behave predictably, and though I wouldn't complain if crawling or dragging crates had been sped up a little faster, it is far from problematic enough to be an issue. Crucially, the lives and the hit points have been balanced decently well. I typically didn't stay maxed on the hit points for any stretch of time, nor did I ever keep an egregious abundance of lives, so getting hit or dying actually kept enough significance to feel the stakes. But I also did not typically suffer stress from the starvation of these pickups. That's a hard line to balance for any similar game, and since I have seen better games fumble that ball, looking at the Wild West levels in the OG Little Big Planet, I again am more than willing to give credit where it is due. Now that typically brigade I sprinkled into my script is doing a little heavy lifting, we'll get into the exception later, and the balance came more from the gain and loss of lives, with pizza slice hit points being less common than I would have figured. But still, the fact that I am able to speak only in these quibbling specifics should tell you I was prepared for worse. Most of the game, unsurprisingly, is platforming. These levels do a good job with a varied and dynamic layout, often having 2 valid paths to get to the same point, and commonly hiding bonuses in clever nooks and crannies. so it retained a fun sense of exploration throughout. It also does a good job literally signposting the right way to go, so younger players don't get lost, but it never felt demeaning or patronizing about it. If I see a sign saying to go one way and a route going elsewhere, my brain gets excited that there may be treasure in store the wrong way, so I ended up liking this setup. Sometimes you will see a warning sign which is giving you a heads up of some sort of imminent danger. This does not always happen, and it often doesn't happen for the same hazard too many times, but anytime I saw that, I appreciated the touch so I could be just a little bit more prepared to get shot in the face by lava. For example, the jumping from point to point between hazards, some of them insta-kill, and moving platforms is always approachable while not being too easy on the whole. There are a few places the game is guilty of having the farthest required jumps end up leaning a tad unfair. See, some nearly max out the length of the jump. This would be fine and normal for the genre, but the problem is Fargield's hitbox. It's surprisingly rear-heavy, and not just from his absolute dump truck. I mean to say his tail appears to count for where he can stand in the space dimension. His fat fucking feet can be off the platform, but if his tail is above it, it counts as standing on it. So my jumps were falling short early on because I wasn't giving him his maximal space to clear the hard jumps. Once I got that down, it became far more reasonable again, punishing me for fair mistakes while allowing me the finer control to claim victory for decent stretches in between, though said stretches were thankfully not long enough to inflate my ego. Lord knows this channel will go downhill fast if I ever start to develop some self-esteem. That butt slam is used for a couple of things. First is just smashing specific weak items or pushing buttons in the environment to give a little more engagement than just moving and jumping, but the other is a combat option. As Garfuck has no normal melee attacks, you have to jump on enemies, giving you a coin. However, if you butt slam them, you get 2 coins. There's actually just a little more skill needed to do this, due to the mid-air delay the action causes, so you have to carefully line up the enemies in motion with your timing. It adds enough risk-reward to bring the engagement up a notch, as messing up means you aren't landing on them correctly, and now they are a hazard to you again. We won't pretend this is something like figuring out Bloodborne combat techniques, but it does make you stop and think. With only 1 hit point, is it worth the risk? You will get coins faster, and that secret door will boost you several lives if you can buy it, but it's been a while since the checkpoint, and if I mess up, I lose a life, and so on. Nothing groundbreaking in this design, but thoughtful design all the same. I will say that the combat does have some nitpicks. Sometimes, bordering on frequently, hitboxes are again quite weird, as what it considers a jump attack to make you safe, and what it doesn't, leaving you unsafe, is based on an arbitrary metric I could never quite define. There were a few enemy types I was certain didn't take damage at all, until I accidentally killed them trying and failing to avoid them, and only one late-game enemy clearly communicated its status because it is obviously too pointy to land on. Certainly, an enemy with a shell has some defense. Nope, it is nothing. Tornadoes, absolutely, wouldn't be able to take. Nope, pounded it away with my power bottom too. Sometimes it was just deliberate, tricky movements, like the fucking crows, which seemed especially good at eating my ass when I inevitably messed up the timing. But sometimes it was just not clearly telegraphed. It never ruined the game, as I have obviously been surprisingly positive, even though I am half drunk as I write this and love roasting unsuspecting video game victims, but it was still less consistent than the platforming. We'll look at those doors since they're the other gameplay thing, and also the only part of the game that gets into that bit I alluded to earlier about playing with the third dimension. These allow Grim Fandango to, as he explains it, sleepwalk briefly to gain some extra lives. And since he is perhaps no longer in the dream, but the real world, I'll explain my weird emphasis in a sec, it makes sense that it has more depth, literal and figurative. There are 3 versions of this, 2 of which make me doubt that it is the real world at all. In the first, Gutfeld smooshes spiders. That's the gag Jim Davis returns to when he's been leaning too hard on eat all the food. So far, so good. Then there's one where you have to stomp trash cans, most of which are filled with bombs. And the last one, where there are multiple trash cans in the kitchen, despite one being in the corner already, but you have to avoid automated mines to get to them. Now, either this means John is secretly into domestic terrorism, which I highly doubt despite the humorous potential, or Gargar Binks is actually inceptioning himself deeper within his dreams so that he can no longer differentiate between dreams and reality. Could this be the explanation for that freaky-ass comic storyline? No. So this is probably the best time to address it. Despite being a pretty alright game all in all, and despite the Gargle mythos being surprisingly willing to turn into abject horror, and despite the little thing called the goddamn title, this game absolutely drops the ball on the horror angle it could have worked more with. Of the 4 worlds, only one goes about 3/4 there, having ghosts and spooky creatures in an old castle, and when another appears to start shifting to dark and stormy for a single level, it rapidly whips back around to a literal rainbow and sunshine immediately after. Don't misunderstand me, I wasn't expecting Dead Space levels of body horror and graphic violence. Though I would have been intrigued to see that too, I do suppose. But something more tonally akin to Luigi's Mansion, or even the freakier elements of Kirby lore, would have been a better fit. I do think this leans towards false advertising. I consider this pretty equivalent to the time the Flash Game Boy game put Batman on the cover, even though I then didn't get to summon Batman as a support ally. Though at least for that character I can cope with action figures, something I refuse to do for this franchise. And since we're on to negatives, the game's biggest problem, which is actually just reinforcing the comparative quality since I would not be capable of getting this deep on a totally incompetent game, is its feedback loop. If you're not familiar with the terms, and to really simplify them down for my purposes, a positive feedback loop is when a game rewards you for success, thereby reinforcing the outcome frequency of success. Think a kill streak special in a multiplayer game. A negative feedback loop, on the flip side, is when a game punishes you for failure, thereby reinforcing the outcome frequency of failure. Technically, positive and negative do not always reflect good for the player or bad for the player with feedback loops, and actually reflect how the game grows closer to an equilibrium within its systems, but properly explaining that will really jive against the dumbass slacker weirdo persona I'm laying on thick for this video, and if I don't obfuscate my intelligence here, people might start to have actual expectations from me, and then I would run a higher risk being a disappointment somewhere down the line, and we can't go having that now, trust me. Feedback loops can be a tricky thing to pull off even for great games. It's why the blood vials in Bloodborne are more universally disliked than the Estus flask in other From softies. If you're already doing great, excess vials picked up go into your storage at your base of operations and automatically re-enter your inventory up to a cap of 20 upon respawning. However, if you are struggling and quickly use all of those, you will find yourself respawning with fewer than that number because you're all out and will be forced to either go farm for more or to go buy more, which you won't be able to do since your currency is dropped on death, and you'd have to get to the place you died to pick those back up without dying, without healing items, which seems like an unlikely outcome for a scrub like yourself. Now, I think there are justified lore reasons behind this design within Bloodborne, but most people will choose better gameplay loops instead because they are healthier and more well-adjusted than BaneShake's Charlie. Today's relevant game suffers from its feedback loops if or when they take a turn towards the negative. This is that exception I dropped into the difficulty balance portion. See, in the third world, I had a series of some rather silly flubs that probably would have been avoided if I hadn't been sleep deprived, but that's just my life now, oh well, and the whole situation started to snowball. The Garth Brooks Nightmare for DS situation, that is. I don't think it's possible for the sleep deprivation to possibly snowball at this point. As it turns out, beyond the hit points and the lives, there is a third, more hidden tracker. If you run out of lives for a game over, it doesn't just send you back to the start of the current level. It also has an additional tracker for tries remaining, and if you run out of those, it sends you back to the very beginning of the world you are on. The problem is that when you hit a game over, it also wipes your current inventory. Donuts are no biggie, but coins are. The fastest way to get more lives is those secret doors. And by this point in the game, those secret doors in the middle of the world cost around 40 or 50 coins each. Without these screw-ups, that's a balanced number, as you'll have a lot of coins. With these screw-ups, even if you collect every coin in the level before the door, and power bottom your way through every enemy to get the double coin bonus, you won't quite be there for all of the doors, just from what the current level provided you. And I firmly think the developers balanced World 3's levels around those extra lives. They are more mechanically complex than what came before, and I was constantly sweating it until inevitable failure reset me. It lost the balance of stakes versus success, and just served as a frustration. That hard reset did confirm my suspicions though. On attempt numero dos, in a blank slate without the initial screw-ups and a couple initial levels to gather coins, and that previous balance from before remained. Considering that the default fan base of Garfheads, their word not mine, is likely made up of younger or more inexperienced gamers, based purely on my speculations of course, this feedback loop issue could likely be a pretty big sticking point to the people most likely to want to play it. Normally, my favorite thing to do in this part of the video is announce story time, and then humorously recap the plot in about 75% summary and 25% abridged series fashion. See my Assassin's Creed or Arkham series for that. But it should come as a surprise to absolutely no one, except my dog, who is not very smart but I love her anyway, that this game barely has an excuse of a plot to try to justify the goings-on. We get a custom comic strip utilizing both screens to show Glengarry eating a sandwich, which appears to be absolutely an affront to God herself, and then sleeping too soon thereafter, thus causing his weird dream. This doesn't faze him in the slightest, as he is instantly genre-aware about the whole thing. The first world is appropriately gloomy, filled with ghosts and medieval death traps. Deep down, I think most people would be at least nominally interested in seeing him subjected to horrifically final slapstick on some level, so that's fun. I particularly like the derpy-looking bats, which are just excessively charming in a way I cannot explain. Weird design choice that I would notice for the entirety of the game. When Grunkleford takes damage, he makes a default cat sound. And while that should just seem normal, considering how they typically give him a deep man voice in adaptation, I find it sounds quite uncanny valley. I never got used to it. The music, however, was appropriately moody, but in a fun way, to match. At the end of the world, we have our first boss fight against Warren Beatty. The boss naming gets a bit weird here, though in a way consistent with the franchise. This franchise loves puns referencing actors and works no child is ever going to understand. Except then there's never any depth or additional layer to the puns. Like if I pointed to a random tree and named it Roger Moore Leaves, that's as deep as these are gonna get. Anyway, this one should probably be named Warren Batty to differentiate it more from the actor Warren Beatty being referenced, but no, there's only one T in there. They couldn't even get that right. Warren tries to bomb you with an advanced technique for his later stages. Ear rape. I was, wearing headphones. World 2 loses the spooky thread for what very specifically feels like the land before time, though it quite tragically lacks dinosaurs. It does have, turtles and giant mosquitoes, though, because giant bugs are definitely what I'm looking for when I expect dinosaurs. There are also mushrooms you have to hold down A on so that your jump gets you the maximum distance away from a poison cloud. I will say that the music for this world really appealed to me, bringing back a reminiscence of classic platformer music, like Stuart Copeland's impeccable work on Spyro the Dragon. In fact, this world's music was giving me such strong vibes that I just had to look it up. And you guys, you wouldn't believe it, but this game's soundtrack is composed by none other than Matthias Gilch. Admit it, for a second there, I had you believing that Stuart Copeland had composed a Garfield game. This boss fight is a dragon named Patrick Sweaty. That's a reference to Patrick Swayze, who I guess was in a movie with a dragon a couple years prior, so it's technically more justified. He uses the 3D space well, since he's in the background and is only vulnerable when his head leans into the 2D plane making up the foreground. World 3 is vaguely Jack and the Beanstalk-esque, taking place in the clouds with occasional beanstalks, though lacking any other fairy tale-ish specifics. It is still cohesively themed around being light and floaty though. Instead of heavy crates you have to smash, like the other worlds, the coins are in bubbles that pop on contact, and the platforming here uses the likes of fans and balloons. These end up being the most mechanically unique moments of the game, and despite having murderized me so badly, I think the whole game would have been a step even better if the other worlds had tried to be as novel with the mechanics as it gets here. In some places, balloon platforms rise automatically, and shift left or right depending on how far to one side you stand on them. In others, there will be balloons you stand atop, and having to jump again to change direction. This world also had my favorite boss design, a floating balloon dog who drops water balloons, named Jean-Claude. I'm certain this was supposed to be a Jean-Claude Van Damme reference, but Jean-Claude is just a first name in the first place. This would be like making a Bigfoot-themed spoof of Harrison Ford, but just calling it Harryson. Come on guys, just a little effort in the jokes would be nice. I want to see at least one effort given. Unfortunately, Jean-Claude's fight suffers from a very inconsistent hitbox, and so I died more to him for reasons beyond my control than anything else in the game. Finally, by the time of the final ice-themed world, Garlic's Nightmare felt like it was starting to run out of steam. Which is appropriate, as I was starting to run out of steam too. I think it's exemplified best with the penguin enemies, shuffling back and forth, visibly depressed out of their skulls. I feel like there's some environmental storytelling to these guys. Based on their red mohawks, I think they used to be pretty free-spirited, Punk in the best possible way. They used to believe they could make great works of art, truly capturing what it means to be penguin, maybe even making a real difference in the world. But slowly, the soulless corporate grind wore them down until they were merely a shell of their former selves, the indomitable penguin spirit sanded away by the exploitative labor practices of penguin capitalism and the stresses of constantly inflating rent, and constantly inflating cost of living, and the shrinking penguin middle class. But what can they do about it? How can they possibly be a creative free spirit in this suffocating penguin society? Unrelated note, but I've put together a Patreon. I haven't had time to put together any of the rewards yet because I have to work a full-time normal people job. Jesus Christ, those penguins are going to be me within the next 5 years, aren't they? Back to the point. Fuck every enemy that shoots snowballs in this level. They are bullshit. This world's boss is a giant snowman named Franz Kafka. Not only is that not even a reference to an actor old people like all of the others, the only connection to the turn of the 20th century writer it's spoofing is squinting to see some potential Kafka-esque overlap with the penguin diatribe I literally had to overinterpret from the game. I would have to literally turn into one of those penguins as a reflection on modern life to make this a true connection. This joke is bad and dumb, and it deserves to feel bad and dumb. I was also a bit confused about the boss mechanics the first few times, but it finally clicked for me. The hold to jump mechanic used on mushrooms half the game ago gets you high enough to land on him, and suddenly this fight became a cakewalk. With that, Garfield is finally able to wake up, learning the exact wrong lesson of not adventuring on an empty stomach, even though this whole thing happened because it was not on an empty stomach, though I can't say that's inconsistent with his normal material. There's a nice 3D render of their living room for the credits, though I'm not sure why he has this albino bear? Polar bear? Regardless, bearskin rug in the middle of the room. Seems a bit unethical. And then there are a few touchscreen minigames involving dragging 2D images around in 3D space, though sadly, those are not really anything worth writing home about. This is not some mind-blowing game, but I can say I was pleased enough by the quality present that I mostly enjoyed my time with it, and that far exceeded expectations. There's probably a great question to be raised as to whether this game would be better or worse without the branding, as you could easily replace the main character with an original creation for the same effect, or replace the bosses' faces with the likes of John, Odie, Nermal, and Liz perhaps, to lean more into the weird nightmare concept and tie it closer to the brand. But I don't feel like speculating further, lest I just get sad that a fictional feline glutton makes more money in a day than I will in my lifetime. Being a step above fine is surprisingly sufficient for this game, though I obviously won't be calling it my game of the year or anything. I mean, I have to consider all the other games new to me that I've played this year. There was Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. No, I played that last year. Maybe... no... Shit. I currently do have to consider Garfield's Nightmare my current game of the year on a technicality. I do not like that.